Welcome to the Creative Ticket podcast, brought to you by Pacific Video. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which this podcast has been originally created, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people listening today. I am Geraldo Rodriguez, Sydney-based actor, writer, and director, and on this podcast I'll talk to artists from all over the world about their craft, their careers, inspirations, and insights. If you are an arts fanatic like myself, make sure to follow and subscribe so you won't miss out on new episodes. Michelle Yañez-Olivares is the creator of Amiga Mía, the largest Latin American community hub in the APAC region. As a community manager, she brings together more than 80,000 people through her channels on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Spotify. She's the host of the podcast, the Amiga Mía Talk Show, where she talks to inspiring members of the Latin American culture in Australia. Welcome to the Creative Ticket, Michelle. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Geraldo. I really appreciate being part of this. And yeah, I'm always up for a really good conversation with someone in the community. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I'd like to start, if you could share a little bit about how Amiga Mía started.
Yeah. So basically how it started was about 2017 is probably where I put that it started. I used to travel to work. Was raised in Sydney, and I would travel to work to the city, and it took me about an hour and a half one way from where I lived to the city. And so I had so much time. And as a good millennial, I always went to social media to find memes and something that was relatable to my experience. So I'm the first in my family born in Australia. The rest of my family migrated from Chile. And so I lived in this blended space. So I wanted to find memes on Facebook at the time that was relatable to being in Australia, but being of Latin heritage, Latin background, and that blended experience. And I couldn't find any. So I actually started generating memes. I would either find them, and then I would change them, edit them, and repost them. I would find them or I would create them, and I would send them to friends and family just to kind of kill time. And then eventually I was sending it to so many people that I thought, you know what, I'm just going to create a Facebook page, call it Latina Lifestyle, and I'm just going to post them there. And then whoever sees them is whoever sees them. And I directed my friends and family to go to that page. Yeah.
So,
and that's how it started, memes.
And do you have that drive to humor, to comedy from back somewhere, from your childhood, from your teenage years, or is it something that has always been with you, or did you think that the Latin America community in Australia has that to offer, has that good humor to offer?
Good question. I definitely got it both. So my family, especially my dad and my brothers, they are always making jokes. It is very much part of my family dynamic. They used to like dress up and create skits, which is like these make-believe comedy shows, and they would make fun of like different people in my family, and it would be very normal. So I grew up in that environment. But then equally on the other side, every time I was part of the community, I always found it to be part of the culture to make jokes and make fun of stuff and, make fun of each other and make fun of other people. And it was never in a derogatory way, although sometimes it can be, unfortunately. But the majority of the time, it was lighthearted humor. So, yeah, from both sides.
And I went to see the Ike Funny Comedy Night, the Latin American Comedy Night at Sydney Comedy Festival recently, which you produced. How was that experience like for you?
Oh, it was amazing. So what happened was and if anyone wants to ever do this in future, I'll tell you how I did it.
Great.
So I went onto the Sydney Comedy Festival website and I submitted an application because I saw an advertisement that said, if you want to be part of the show, submit an application. So I thought, I never thought of it before, but I'm going to do it. So I wrote just a whole comedy show about me being a comedian and talking about my mom and my family growing up as Chileans. And, making fun of my mom's accent. She couldn't, and my dad, they couldn't speak English too well. My brothers with this identity crisis and the food and all, my whole experience of being Latin in Australia and the challenges, but in a funny way. And then I submitted it and I didn't think anything of it. Then about 2 weeks later, the general manager called me. His name's James, and he said, "Hey, we love your idea, and we think it's amazing, and we want to have more diverse shows in terms of different cultural backgrounds, and so we'd like to offer you the position of having your comedy show." And I said, "Oh, I did that as a joke." um, I didn't really mean it, and so I actually told him no the first time. And then he explained it to me. And the reason why I said no is because he said, we want to put you in a theater that has 380 people. And I was like, that's like going from 0 to 100. I've never done a comedy show in my life to going to 380 people theater. Anyways, he said, please just think about it, think about it. And so I thought about it. And again, I thought, no, I think I sent him an email saying, thank you so much. I don't think that I want to do it. And then eventually I spoke to a few people and I spoke to some, like my brother and some close friends. And there was one person who said to me, like, just go for it, do it. Just, why not? And then also that same person said, why don't you invite other people to be part of the show with you? And then that was, if anything to do with Amiga Mía is about celebrating the community and giving people opportunities that they may not have before. And I thought, that's it. I called him back and I said, look, I will do it providing that I host and I have 3 other comedians from our community, and I will have them in the show. They will be the comedians and I will just host. And he goes, oh, okay, yeah, that's possible. We can do it. Let me think about it. Call me back a week later and he said, okay, done. And that's how it came to life. We agreed and we started to plan towards it.
And was that part of your previous professional experience running events, creating a community? How also, because it's Amiga Mía is as I said before, is the largest community, Latin American community in APAC, not only Australia but New Zealand and the Pacifics. How do you go from 0 to Amiga Mía?
It's interesting. So I would call myself more an audience than a community. So I have a large audience. I think it's now around 85,000 across, and majority across Australia. And you're right, New Zealand, APAC region. I do have quite a following in the lower states of the US and in Europe, but the majority is APAC, right? And so it's just really built over time because I felt that from the very beginning, as I said before, I started to create memes and then started to create stuff on Facebook. If I didn't find memes that I could resonate with, I had an app on my phone, a generator, and I paid for 3 of them. And then I would generate them. And then what happened was I would see how people would react. If people didn't like them, I would stop creating those ones. If people would like them, I would continue to create those ones. And then eventually, it was around the time of, so I had that for a couple of years and it was growing, and there was some ones that went viral, and that I learned from that experience. But then it moved to a point where I started to really get to know the people behind the like. And that really happened in the beginning of the pandemic when we were all locked up. I was in Melbourne at the time. So for those who don't know, Melbourne is the city below Sydney, and it was one of the most locked cities in the world. And we had a curfew, there was military outside. It was really overwhelming. And so I spent, instead of, fortunately, I could keep my full-time job. I was one of the few who could. So then in the spare time, I just invested more time into Latina lifestyle. And I started to actually talk to people and get to know them through DM, through comments. People would send me messages and I would just have a conversation with them. Where do you live? Who you are? What's your story? What's your family? And then getting to know them like that, I started to build relationships. And that's how, now thinking about it, I would say it's as much of an audience as it is a community, because I would like to think that I strongly believe that when you're building something, certainly for me, and you're representing the Latin community or a community in general, is so important to have build relationships. And so I felt it was so important when someone liked my content or they made a comment like, "Oh, this is funny." I would, if they wanted to, of course, I would make the effort to have a conversation with them. And more than just like cool thumbs up, it was like, tell me a bit about yourself. And the pandemic really allowed for that to happen. And that's where I actually lost the question. What was
Ex-
what was
ex-
the
exactly. That's you're pretty much there. It's how do you go from zero to Amiga
yeah.
Mia? How do you get to that? Because I'm gonna get back to the question in a second, just so I explain myself a little bit also. Because having moved to Australia, I moved to Australia 3 years ago, and I feel like moving here as an adult, uh, you start from scratch. You start new relationships. You start maybe a new career, but even if you start in your own profession, you still start from scratch. And having that sense of, there are other people who not that you cannot relate to people from outside your culture, but it's also important to have a little bit of your own culture there so that you can relate. And you are one of the, and I'm really happy that you took that initiative. You had the initiative of creating that community, of creating that audience, of creating content that relates, that we can relate. People from Latin America that come to Australia and they can relate. But I'm wondering, how did that? I know that it started as memes, as a way of creating funny content about our experiences, and I find that's a genius. That's hilarious. That brings people together. But at the same time, I'm wondering if there was a drive to offer that sense of belonging to
Yeah.
people from Latin America, and if that was, how did you cater for it?
I yes, that was the perfect word that you used, was a sense of belonging. And that's what really, that so say I think it was 2016 actually that I created the Facebook page and memes. And that was more than me, just, if I'm very honest with myself, just spending my time to fill the time commuting. But also, I love the idea of like making other people laugh, and my family's really big like that. A couple of years of that, learning and growing, and that was really just growing the Facebook profile. Moved to Instagram, and then that's when I started to really, during the pandemic, around the very beginning of the pandemic, there was a couple of years there where I got to know the people in the community, and I also created an Instagram account. And in the Instagram account, that's pretty much where I built most of the relationships. And because we were during the pandemic as well, I was able to get feedback from people about the content. They said, "Oh, like that doesn't really resonate with me," or "that experience is more for the US, less for Latinos in Australia." And as I would get that feedback and I would talk to people, I would change the content accordingly. And that really helped people feel like they could resonate, feel that they could belong, feel that they could relate. Because if you just do content that's somewhat funny, people get it. But if you do content that speaks to them, people, then it goes far beyond just making them laugh. It makes them say, "Wow, this is a piece of me. This makes me feel like home." And that was so important for me to also make me feel like home, because it was interesting. I had moved to Melbourne. I didn't have any family there. My whole family's in Sydney. And so I moved down with my husband. And so we had no one. Like, he had one family member, but they're not of Latin heritage. And amazing people, but not of Latin heritage. And so I found that was so important for me to also stay connected to my family. And also because all my family is in Chile. I have one tia here. I have one auntie with three cousins, and all the rest of them are in Chile. And I actually had never met a lot of them. I would say like 95% of my family, I had never met them in my life. And so when I would create content about that experience of like, ha ha ha, you know, when your mum shows you the family tree and you've never met them in your life, but you have to follow them all on Facebook, that kind of stuff, people in my experience, people in our community felt the same. Oh, that's so true. I live here in Australia and I have so much family in Argentina and I've never met them before, or haven't seen them in so long. And so what I learned with content creation was you can tap into people's emotions in an ethical and good, kind-hearted way to help them feel like they can belong. And that was a whole nother process of the next couple of years, was really building relationships, getting to know what people needed in terms of a sense of belonging, creating content that aligned with that. And then in terms of how to get to the next level was after the pandemic finished, I did a couple of other things. Like I created jewelry that said words like Latina, Diosa, Hermosa, these sort of positive Spanish affirmation words. But the next turning point was when it got to the end of the pandemic and people were asking me, hey, Amiga, do you know where I can go for a local shop here? Or Amiga, do you know where I can find this? Or people were asking me for recommendations because they trusted two things. They trusted that I would give them a good recommendation, which I value deeply. But second of all, that they found me as sort of like a central source of truth. Because all I did was like look for people and try and find people and then repost their content and create stories about them as well. And so I found that that was a responsibility for me. I took it really serious and I said, okay, cool. And that's when I started to create events. My first ever event was a community meetup in Melbourne, and it was all about connecting Latin women together so we can have a space to talk about challenges, especially women who wanted to be entrepreneurial, business-minded, in leadership roles. That was very important for me. But above all, it was just to make sure that they knew that there was someone here who they could have a connection with. And that started the journey of me hosting live panels and different types of events. And now I'm doing crazy things. But yeah, and so I've kind of, every couple of years, I've kind of just stayed true to the core of what I'm trying to do, but then also see what's the next thing that we can do with the Amiga Mía brand.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And I would like to hear a little bit more about how you see your experience being born in Australia from Chilean parents. And I ask that because I feel like I came to Australia, I was always almost 40. So I'm Brazilian. I will always be Brazilian. I may adapt a little bit to fit in or to have a little bit more things in common with Australian because it's you adapt, you change a little bit. But I know who I am. I know what I like, and I know a little bit of what my Brazilian culture is like. But being born here, I feel like it's easier to spot the differences, and it's easier to look from to see how different it is your perspective to your parents, or is it not?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because it, first I would say that everyone's experience is different, and I've learned that from being part of Amiga Mia. I have some people who were born here and they identify as Chilean, Brazilian, Argentinian. It doesn't matter they were born here. They're very, very strong on the fact that that is where their blood and their ancestry comes from. And then I have people on the other side who they were born in Bolivia and Peru, in Brazil, in Argentina, and Chile. They came here at maybe 10, 12 years old, but they strongly identify as Australian. And so I think every case is different. But in my case, I found that being the firstborn here, I had to learn on the go. So we would speak Spanish at home. And so my parents migrated, and then a few years later, I was born. And so they were speaking in Spanish. They were culturally Chilean. Their social circle was all Latinos, nothing else, right? If they went to work, they had the same struggles like any other Latin person. They had their degrees. My dad's an electrical engineer. My mom was an accountant. They came here. They did the jobs that a lot of Latinos have to do to get by, right? But their circles was all Spanish, and Latino. So they would raise me culturally Chilean. And then I had the first cultural shock when I went to primary school, like many other first generation, where you have to all of a sudden speak English in a school, and then you're just like, wait, hold on, this is a different language to what I speak at home. And I spoke about this in a different podcast where I always recommend, if you have children who are going through this experience, to help guide them through that process, because a lot of the time they don't know how to deal with it, certainly at a really young age. And so, yeah, I found that this experience was, when at my younger years, I had a bit of an identity crisis. I went through the first couple of years not understanding why I would mispronounce words in English, why I went to English as a second language school, why I was a little bit different to everyone else. I also was in an area where there wasn't too many people who were ethnic at the time. It's great to see Australia very multicultural these days, but it certainly wasn't like that, 20 odd years ago. So it was hard. And then I went through a period in high school where I actually just didn't speak Spanish. I didn't embrace my Latin roots, nothing. I kind of just like pushed it to one side because I really wanted to identify as Australian. And it's not that I didn't appreciate that side, because I did, but I've just made extra focus and highlights on being Australian. And I realized I had to go through that to really get to where I am now. And then I reached a point when I was like 18, and then I just found who I was. I was like, I'm a beautiful, I'm Chilean Australian. I'm a blend of both worlds. And whilst I haven't been to Chile, I mean, I've been to South America now three times. I've met family and stuff, but at home I'm culturally Chilean, and I feel like that's how I was raised. And even till now, when I go home to see my parents or my family, that's how they think, that's how they are, that's the food that they eat. But at school and in the different parts of society, I was very much Australian, and I had to assume into the Australian identity. So yeah, it was a constant just blend of both worlds. Yeah.
I, to be honest, I find that I feel like as an immigrant or as someone as yourself that had the experience of living in a household with that spoke Spanish, that had a different culture, walking on the street and seeing other cultures and seeing the Australian culture of the time that you grew up, I feel like that's such a beautiful experience, such a
Mm,
privilege. A
mm.
friend of mine, Julia from Brazil, she lived in the UK for a while, and she said being a migrant is like watching a film, but from the middle on. You don't know how it started. You don't know who is the villain, who is the good guy. You don't know anything, and you're just trying to figure out. So, and I feel like that's a little bit of my experience. But at
Mm.
the same time, having had a different experience, you look at things and you say, "Yeah, we could do things differently." Also, it's pretty much a wonderful privilege, and thank you for sharing that experience here on the Creative Ticket. Um, do you, and a little bit on the practical side behind Amiga Mia, do you work with a team? Do you work individually? Do you have a set of tasks and goals for you as the CEO, as the as the face behind Amiga Mia?
Yeah, I'm a one person show. So I am the only person who's, let's say, employed by Amiga Mia, to put it in that way. But I do definitely, where possible, use contractors. So, for example, and if I will have a project that is upcoming and they need a videographer, I will actually contact a videographer who's of Latin background. So, for example, in the past, I did a campaign for, I helped out J Balvin's show at Kudos Bank Arena. I think it was last year. And so I contacted a friend, so one of those being a Latin consultant called Garcia, who's Peruvian, and asked her to jump on board to help me with some of the consulting side of things. And then I also got a Brazilian called Victor Peña, who now it's great to see now he's working with some really big influential people, and he's doing an incredible job. Both of them are. But I guess, if I have a project and I have the budget that allows me to uh, create a team, I will, and I will always 99% of the time have Latin contractors. And I'm also really big that if someone's already up and running now and they're successful, um, then you let them go, and then you find another contractor who maybe needs that little extra step. So for example, with Kev Funny, I use Kerry. Kerry is a Peruvian videographer, because I know that Victor is now, he's up and running and he's very, very successful. And so absolutely, I would say, and the third part to that, so I'm a one-person show. I have a team of contractors when I need to use them. 99% of the time, they will be Latin and Hispanic. That is a must for me. And not to say that I don't value other people, I absolutely do. But I'm a strong believer that if we don't help each other out first, then who else will? And I believe we have arguably the best talent. Like I've seen enough of this community to know that we have some insanely amazing talent. And also with a different perspective, a different attitude, a different approach. It's sexy, it's fun, it's sophisticated, it's beautiful. Why would I not use that? I'd be crazy not to use it. And then the third part of that is I use AI. So I'm a big believer that a lot of what I do, I use Trello. For those who know Trello, it's a project platform. It's a very easy to use one. And then I use a lot of the Gen AIs out there, the Groks, the Geminis, the ChatGPT to help me. I use Microsoft Bing and other image generators to help generate images. I'm always testing out technology to see if it's going to benefit me. I'm not scared of technology. I embrace it. I come from a background. I used to work for a couple of different tech startups. And so, yeah, it's a mixture of all of those. But I would say that at this point in time in my life, I'm probably working like 3 or 4 people roles myself. And so if I'm very honest with you, this year I am in a process of looking for an investor to jump on board and help me. And that's for the purpose to actually build a team to take this to the next level.
Amazing. What can you share? What are your plans for the future of Amiga Mía?
Yeah. So initially, if we look just at, I guess, a quick overview of my work history, I studied sociology. So I've always been in touch with human interaction. That's always been something that I love. And then I did a couple of years of being an area manager, regional manager, sales manager. So I used to manage 25 stores in fashion. Then I managed a global team, and I had 40 freelancers in Philippines, another like New Zealand, Australia. And then I went to another role in Melbourne where I was a contact center manager. So I had a technical team, a sales team, a support team, and a knowledge-based team. I think it was about 250 people. And I loved it. Like I love doing that because I don't love being in the management role per se. It's more about being able to watch people grow and develop and work together. But then I actually made a pivot and I went into studying a course about how to build communities online. And specifically in the tech space. And I did that whilst I was working my contact center manager job, whilst it was a pandemic. So my job there was like double time and a half, whilst I was trying to build Amiga Mía. And I made that because I wanted to make a career pivot. And then I ended up landing, after I finished that community course, I landed a job in a tech company as the head of community. And I did that for a couple of years, 1 year, and then a different company after that. So that gave me all the skills that I needed today. And then it helped me understand, wait, hold on. I want to do something with Amiga Mía. And that really started when I pivoted towards like learning about community online. And then I reached the point where I was like, okay, cool. I've done the course. I'm now working in tech. I'm now head of community. Then I just landed another job where I was working with big enterprise, like universities, large retail, and I had a team of 30 community managers, a contact center, and we would manage and build their communities. And then I went part-time. And I went part-time because I said I'm going to have 1 day or 2 days where I'm going to build Amiga Mía and a couple of days off. And that happened for about a year. And then it reached a point, I was like, you know what? I told my boss, I loved him. He's amazing. I think he's incredible. And I said, I love what you're doing. And I helped him launch that part of the business. And I said, I've reached everything that I need to reach now. The next step for me is building something for myself. And I had been avoiding this feeling to resign my job, to focus on Amiga Mía for so long, but I had a calling. there was something in me that was like, you just got to do it, Michelle. Like, you just have to. And I answered the phone call. I resigned my job. I went to Chile. I went to Chile, and not only did I go there to meet family and everything, but I went to Patagonia, the south, to reset. That was a beautiful experience. I recommend anyone who hasn't gone there. It was amazing. And I came back and I said, I can do it. I can turn Amiga Mia into something more than just a fun social media brand. I'm going to turn into a Hispanic and Latin media outlet, media company. And so that's what I'm doing now. My now is turning it into media. I haven't studied journalism. Don't have a media and communications background, but that doesn't scare me at all. I feel like I've got all my values um, and my direction and vision is in the right place, and I'm just following my heart and I'm following my community. I always speak to the community to get feedback, and so that's where it's going. And I'm in a place now where I'm exploring partnerships, like we spoke about Sydney Comedy Festival. I've got another couple partnerships that are underway now. I've previously worked with other brands, and so now it's sort of continuing on that trajectory to work with brands and do partnerships. But then also it's actually continuing to formalize Amiga Me into media company and all the steps. So right now it's looking at all the behind the scenes stuff, like getting the accounting right, getting all the legals right. I have a couple of mentors who are teaching me how to switch from being an employee to a business owner. And then on top of that, I do content creation every day, and on top of that, I respond to all the DMs every day. So yeah. But
Yeah.
in terms of where is it going, that like my highest priority right now is turn it into a formalized media company and to secure an investor to help me scale.
Amazing. Amazing. I am confident it will happen sooner than you think. And and I'll tell you why. I have a feeling that the passion that you put in your project and the what you deliver, what you give to the people, to the audience that you have, is very valuable, is brilliant. I have another question. When we talk about Latin America, we are talking about a whole bunch of different countries with different cultures. We're talking about people that speak Spanish, people that speak Portuguese. So it's very diverse in itself. Do you see something that brings us all together, or is it effectively talking to different people, different countries, different cultures, different nationalities?
Yeah, so I've learned over the years that every country is different and every country has its own culture. Every country, even within the country, has its own subcultures. And, regions, for example, like if I just sort of zoom into Chile, the south and the north are very different, even compared to the city. And I'm sure that would be the same in Brazil. Actually, I was speaking to a really great Brazilian friend of mine. She's an actress here in Sydney. She's called Ariane. And she was explaining to me like the different, I think it was Christmas cultures in different parts of Brazil. And she's like, I cannot speak for the north of Brazil. I can only speak for the south of Brazil. And she was very strong on that because she's like, it's so different. So I think personally with Amiga Mia, what I've learned is like, generally speaking, humor is everyone can embrace it, irrespective of where you are, because it's something that like making people laugh. Where I have found and where I have learnt from everywhere, Brazil, Peru, Mexico, everywhere, where it's a very sensitive, rightfully so, area, is culture and talking about like especially like folkloric dance, cultural traditions, cultural customs, cultural rituals, that sort of stuff is very like region specific, if that makes sense. Like you can't even go and say, hey, in Peru, or the number one culture is X, or the number one cultural dance is X, because it's not the case. Every region has their own respective cultural dance, custom, ritual, tradition. And so that's what I've learned. And that's why sometimes in the past, I would post content about that. And then I would just go, oh, a Peruvian dance Or, ooh, like a dance from Guatemala. And people be like, no, that's actually from this region and that region and da 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 da. And they all have an amazing point. I'm not going to be one person to say you're right or you're wrong. That's not my position, and that will never be my position. So I've just learned that that's an area where you have to really get it right and present it in a way that is as respectful as possible. And so, that being said, I don't want to disrespect anyone. I don't want to create any malintention. That's not my intention. And so I try to stick as best as possible to like humor and motivation and that kind of stuff. And then also on top of that, what I do to my best to centralize is the experience that we are all Latin in Australia. And that's where I feel like we can all come together. You know, I don't speak for Latinos in Latin America. I speak for Latinos in Australia. And I feel like that's the one thing we all have in common, that we come from that region, irrespective of the cultural traditions, irrespective of the country, irrespective of the language. We all come from that region, and now we all live in this country.
Do you feel like maybe the biggest difference is actually between Brazilians and Spanish speaking people? Because the language, although it's similar, it's still a barrier, or it doesn't matter. There is a little bit of a separation between Argentina and Chile, Paraguay and Chile, as there is between Brazil and Argentina, Brazil and Paraguay, Brazil and Chile.
Yeah. So what I've noticed is there's definitely, absolutely. I have a lot of Brazilians who will reach out. I remember once, that's actually my very ever first event that I hosted in Melbourne. This is like many years ago. And it was, I'm trying to remember the shop so I can give them a shout out. But the very first person who ever attended that from Amiga Mía was a Brazilian. And I remember she walked up, she's like, hi. And I was like, hi. I was there nervous, waiting for the first person to join my first ever community meetup in person after the pandemic. It was very sort of overwhelming. And she rocked up and she was Brazilian. And I remember the feedback that she told me. She sat down and we were waiting for everyone, and we just sat down and I think we were having some chips or something. And she goes, Amiga, I really wished, I love the content that you post, but I really wished you posted more content that was relatable to Brazilians. And I said, oh, I'm so sorry. And I said, it's so like, you know, for me, it's not intentional, but at the same time, when you do, I have to appreciate that when you do say Latin, you do have to take into consideration everyone in the region. And I started asking her questions like, what would content look like for you? And she just said, you know, content like every now and then in Portuguese or referencing Portuguese, or she was the one who taught me about Portuñol. And I was like, I was so excited. Portuñol? What is Portuñol? She's like, yeah, you know, we speak Portuguese and Spanish and we call it Portuñol. And I was like, oh my God, you know, I fell in love. But I realized at the time the gap was that because I was born and raised in my community with Spanish speakers, and in my family circle, it was all Spanish speakers, I actually didn't have any Brazilian friends. And no one who could sort of give me that insight, give me that education on the Brazilian culture. And so that's, at that point, her being the first one really helped me, give me that insight into it. And I feel like it's definitely, the language is one huge part of it. I've definitely had other Brazilians reach out and said, I do not resonate with your content at all because it's all Hispanic related. And I get it. Like, I fully get it. But then on the other side to that, I do have, so I just to kind of go, I do make the effort as much as possible now, you know, to include content about like the Brazilian experience, Brazilian culture. In all of my panels, I've had Ariane, a Brazilian girl, for the Christmas version. I had Gio for my very first panel in Sydney. And that's very important for me because they also give us a very valuable perspective that we need. But on top of that, I do also find a very similar disparity between, for example, like Argentina and Uruguay, right? When you speak to them about salsa, even Chile, Paraguay, Uruguay, Argentina, they don't necessarily resonate with content about like salsa. You know, when you post content about like Puerto Rican, Cuban, Colombian salsa and always dancing salsa and Mark Anthony and all the salsa rhythms, they're like, Michelle, we don't listen to that. We listen to more cumbia. I've had multiple people, my own family. I remember when I went to Chile, they said, Michelle, why do you always post content about salsa? Here in Chile, we don't really, maybe, yeah, one or two people may dance salsa, okay, but the greater majority, we don't really listen to salsa. It doesn't mean that all Latinos listen to salsa. And I was like, oh, okay. There's different examples of that. Or like when you talk about mate, right, to like someone in Venezuela or Colombia, they're like, what is mate? What they drink in Uruguay and Argentina. Oh, I've never heard of that in my life. And so there's definitely different cultural experiences that definitely kind of separate people, and then they don't resonate with them. And then sometimes they make a comment about it. Yeah, for sure.
Amazing. And the question that I was going to ask before is, do you feel like for a migrant or as someone from a different background whose parents were from overseas, it takes an extra effort to feel like they belong in Australia? If it takes an extra effort to see or to learn about Australian culture, and how does that, because we're talking about the Latin American culture, either from whatever country we come from, but there is also the Australian culture, is also part of the process of feeling like you belong, learning about the Australian culture, trying to figure out what was the beginning of the film that we didn't watch.
Yeah, I definitely would say so. So for example, my parents, because they didn't go through the schooling system and they didn't have university here, and they didn't, even for a lot of Latinos, like they don't work with Australians, they work with other Latinos. And so if you don't subject yourself to the culture, you don't learn it. So sometimes I do actually say to people, like, you really do need to kind of force yourself into those situations where you can embrace the culture. And then people will say to me, but what is Australian culture? And it's true. Like, it's really hard. Like, back in the day, I would have said to you, Australian culture is going to the beach, having a barbecue, sipping like Tui's New or VB, whatever. And then, like, that's Australian, But you go out into other parts of the cities and urban areas, it's nothing to do with that, and it's still considered Australian culture. And so, yeah, absolutely. I definitely think that if you're not part of the, like, let's say the schooling system, and you don't really have work here where you're in a workplace that is deeply Australian in terms of like the founders are Australian, the values are Australian, all that sort of stuff. Maybe you work for a company that's foreign and they have foreign values or whatever, then yeah, I definitely think it's a struggle to understand it and to appreciate it. But on top of that, because Australia is so multicultural, it's multicultural. Now I feel like we've come to a place where they were saying that over 50% of the total population, they themselves are migrants, or their parents are migrants, or one parent is a migrant, and they bring their culture to their whole way of living. And so it's like, what is Australians' culture then? It's a combination of everyone's culture. It's deeply multicultural. And so, yeah, like, that's why with Amiga Mia as well, like, I often offer people to, um, like, I give them insight into it, what it means to be like Australian, what the Australian culture is, and yeah, because that's what I am. I'm a blend of both, and if I can help, I will.
And you were saying back in the day, probably Australian culture, going to the beach, having a barbecue, uh, trying a VB, and etc.
Playing
What
cricket.
cricket? Yes. What else do you feel? Because I have a few guesses. I see, now that I've been here for 3 years. I see a few things. Probably my vision will change. My point of view will change with in the future. But I see a few things that I feel like are valued, like characteristics, personality characteristics, that people try to and see as something that makes them proud, or they try to behave that way. And I think Australians are authentic. I think they're very upfront. They're very honest about how they're feeling, what they think, most of the times.
Mm.
For you, what is there a way you could describe Australian culture, or you could describe how you've experienced the Australian culture, your Australian side?
Yeah, I would say based on so I have because I went to high school here, I have a lot of friends who are still like Aussie. Like I have a group of friends who are like as Aussie can be, you know. They're the ones that will tell you like, oh, like all the way up to the family tree, I'm as Aussie as one can be. And so the first word that stands out is easygoing. Aussies are easygoing. Like there's nothing too, they don't take life too serious. Let's put it that way. Like when I would go to my Aussie friends' houses for like lunch or after school to hang out, like you would see their parents and it'd be like, oh, hey, how you going? Yeah, food's in the fridge if you want some. Yeah, just whatever you want to do. Yeah, no worries. That's where like the whole, yeah, no worries. Yeah, easy going. Like it's just a very relaxed kind of way of being. Now, that's not all of my Aussie friends. There's obviously some who are a lot more strict, but the greater majority of my Aussie friends, they had that kind of type of, way of being. And then you would compare it to my family who were all like loud and Latino and like passion and that sort of stuff. But yeah, the first thing that comes front of mind in terms of Aussie culture is like easygoing. Yeah, no worries. Yeah, I don't know if you've ever heard this Aussie saying called "she'll be right."
She'll be right, yeah.
That's the perfect way of like, if I would spill milk at home, my mum would lose her shit, like start yelling at me in Spanish, and then my dad would yell because she's yelling, and it's the whole thing. But when you do that at my Aussie friend's house, like her mum will be like, oh, that's all right, clean it up, she'll be right. Like nothing stresses them.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. Michelle, there is one last question that I ask all my guests here on the Creative Ticket. And the question is, what makes you, you?
Oh, what a question. That's a very introspective question. I would say I am a reflection of my environment. I always like to say I'm a product of my environment. I'm a reflection of my environment. I'm a reflection of my upbringing. I'm a reflection of my ancestry. I'm a reflection of my heritage. I'm a reflection of how much effort I put into my life. I'm a reflection of my grandma. She was the one, my abuelita Inés. She played a big role in my life, and she's the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing now with Amiga Mía. I am a reflection of all of that. Of my family, of my upbringing, of my location, of my heritage, of my ancestry, of my culture, of my hard work, of my community. That's what makes me me.
Brilliant. You mentioned your abuelita Inés as an inspiration for you. I am definitely sure she would be really proud of the way you are bringing the Latin American community together through Amiga Mía. Thank you so much for being on the show, Michelle. It was an honor talking to you.
I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Creative Ticket podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, please remember to share this with your friends and family and subscribe so you can stay up to date with new episodes. Feel free to reach out to hello@pacificvideo.com.au for feedback and suggestions. We would love to hear from you. Take care.